The Terror from the Depths. Fritz Leiber. Remember thee, aye, thou poor ghost, while memory holds a seat in this distracted globe. Hamlet. The following manuscript was found in a curiously embossed copper and German silver casket of highly individual modern workmanship, which was purchased at an auction of unclaimed property that had been held in police custody for the prescribed number of years in Los Angeles County, California. In the casket with the manuscript were 2 slim volumes of verse, Azathoth and Other Horrors by Edward Pickman Derby, Onyx Sphinx Press, Arkham, Massachusetts, and The Tunneler Below by Georg Reuter Fischer, Ptolemy Press, Hollywood, California. The manuscript was penned by the second of these poets, except for the 2 letters and the telegram interleaved into it. The casket and its contents had passed into police custody on March 16, 1937, upon the discovery of Fischer's mutilated body by his collapsed brick dwelling in Vulture's Roost, under circumstances of considerable horror. Today, one will search street maps of the Hollywood Hills area in vain for the unincorporated community of Vulture's Roost. Shortly after the events narrated in these pages, already long criticized, was changed upon the urging of prudent real estate dealers to Paradise Crest, which was in turn absorbed by the city of Los Angeles, an event not without parallel in that general neighborhood, as when, after certain scandals best forgotten, the name of Runnymede was changed to Tarzana, after the chief literary creation of its most illustrious and blameless inhabitant. The magneto-optical method of detection referred to herein, which has already discovered 2 new elements, is neither fraud nor fancy, but a technique highly regarded in the 1930s, though since discredited, as may be confirmed by consulting any table of elements from that period or the entries Alabamine and Virginium in Webster's New International Dictionary, 2nd edition, unabridged. They are not, of course, in today's tables. While the unknown master builder Simon Rhodia, with whom Fischer's father conferred, is the widely revered folk architect, now deceased, who created the matchlessly beautiful Watts Towers. It is only with considerable effort that I can restrain myself from plunging into the very midst of a description of those unequivocally monstrous hints that have determined me to take, within the next 18 hours and no later, a desperate and initially destructive step. There is much to write, and only too little time in which to write it. I myself need no written argument to bolster my beliefs. It is all more real to me than everyday experience. I have only to close my eyes to see Albert Wilmarth's horror-whitened long-jawed face and migraine-tormented brow. There may be something of clairvoyance in this, for I imagine his expression has not changed greatly since I last saw him, and I need not make the slightest effort to hear those hideously luring voices, like the susurrus of infernal bees and glorious wasps, which impinge upon an inner ear which I can now never and would never close. Indeed, as I listen to them, I wonder if there is anything to be gained from penning this necessarily outre document. It will be found, if it is found, in a locality where serious people do not attach any importance to strange revelations and where charlatanry is only too common. Perhaps that is well, and perhaps I should make doubly sure by tearing up this sheet, for there is in my mind no doubt of the results that would follow a systematic, scientific effort to investigate those forces which have ambushed and shall soon claim, and perhaps welcome, me. I shall write, however, if only to satisfy a peculiar personal whim. Ever since I can remember, I have been drawn to literary creation. But until this very day, certain elusive circumstances and Crepuscular forces have prevented my satisfactorily completing anything more than a number of poems, mostly short, and tiny prose sketches. It would interest me to discover if my new knowledge has freed me to some extent from those inhibitions. Time enough when I have completed this statement to consider the advisability of its destruction, before I perpetrate the greater and crucial destruction. Truth to tell, I am not especially moved by what may or may not happen to my fellow men. There have been profound influences, yes, from the depths indeed, exerted upon my emotional growth and upon the ultimate direction of my loyalties, as will become clear to the reader in due course. I might begin this narrative with a bald recital of the implications of the recorded findings of Professors Atwood and Poverty's portable magneto-optic geoscanner, or with Albert Wilmarth's horrendous revelations of the mind-shattering planet-wide researches made during the past decade by a secret coterie of faculty members of far-off Miskatonic University, in witch-haunted, shadow-beset Arkham, and a few lonely colleagues in Boston and Providence, Rhode Island. Or with the shivery clues that with nefarious innocence have found their way even into the poetry I have written during the past few years. If I did that, you would be immediately convinced that I was psychotic. The reasons that led me, step by step, to my present awesome convictions would appear as progressive symptoms, and the monstrous horror behind it all would seem a shuddersome paranoid fantasy. Indeed, that will probably be your final judgment in any case, but I will nevertheless tell you what happened just as it happened to me. Then you will have the same opportunity as I had to discern, if you can, just where reality left off, and imagination took up, and where imagination stopped, and psychosis supervened. Perhaps within the next 17 hours, something will happen or be revealed that will in part substantiate what I shall write. I do think so, for there is yet untold cunning in the decadent cosmic order which has entrapped me. Perhaps they will not let me finish this narrative. Perhaps they will anticipate my own resolve. I am almost sure they have only held off thus far because they are sure I will do their work for them. No matter. The sun is just now rising, red and raw, over the treacherous and crumbling hills of Griffith Park. Wilderness were a better designation. The sea fog still wraps the sprawling suburbs below. Its last vestiges are sliding out of high, dry Laurel Canyon. But far off to the south, I can begin to discern the black congeries of scaffold oil wells near Culver City, like stiff-legged robots massing for the attack. And if I were at the bedroom window that opens to the northwest, I would see night's shadow still lingering in the precipitous wilds of Hollywood land, above the faint, twisting, weed-encroached, serpent-haunted trails I have limped along daily for most of my natural life, tracing and retracing them ever more compulsively. I can turn off the electric light now. My study is already pierced by shafts of low, red sunlight. I am at my table, ready to write the day through. Everything around me has the appearance of eminent normality and security. There are no signs remaining of Albert Wilmarth's frantic midnight departure with the magneto-optic apparatus he brought from the east. Yet as if by clairvoyance, I can see his long-jawed, horror-sucked face as he clings automatically to the steering wheel of his little Austin, scuttling across the desert like a frightened beetle, the geoscanner lying on the seat beside him. This day's sun has reached him before me, as he flees back toward his deeply beloved, impossibly distant New England. That sun's smoky red blaze must be in his fear-wide eyes, for I know that no power can turn him back toward the land that slips uncouth into the Titan Pacific. I bear him no resentment. I have no reason to. His nerves were shattered by the terrors he bravely insisted on helping to investigate for 10 long years against his steadier comrades' advice. And at the very end, I am certain, he saw horrors beyond imagining. Yet he waited to ask me to go with him, and only I know how much that must have cost him. He gave me my opportunity to escape, if I had wanted to. I could have made the attempt, but I believe my fate was decided many years ago. My name is Georg Reuter Fischer. I was born in 1912 of Swiss parents in the city of Louisville, Kentucky, with an inwardly twisted right foot which might have been corrected by a brace, except that my father did not believe in interfering with the workings of nature, his deity. He was a mason and stonecutter of great physical strength, vast energy, remarkable intuitive gifts, a dowser for water, oil, and metals, great natural artistry, unschooled but profoundly self-educated. A little after the Civil War, when he was a young boy, he had immigrated to this country with his father, also a mason, and upon the death of the latter, inherited a small but profitable business. Late in life he married my mother, Marie Reuter, daughter of a farmer for whom he had doused not only a well, but a deposit of granite worth quarrying. I was the child of their age and their only child, coddled by my mother and the object of my father's more thoughtful devotion. I have few memories of our life in Louisville, but those few are eminently wholesome ones, visions of an ordered, cheerful household, of many cousins and friends, of visitings and laughter, and 2 great Christmas celebrations. Also, memories of fascinatedly watching my father at his stone-cutting, bringing a profusion of flowers and leaves to life from death-pale granite. And I will say here, because it is important to my story, that I afterward learned that our Fischer and Reuter relatives considered me exceptionally intelligent for my tender age. My father and mother always believed this, but one must allow for parental bias. In 1917, my father profitably sold his business and brought his tiny family west to build with his own hands a home in this land of sunlight, crumbling sandstones, and sea-spawned hills, Southern California. This was in part because doctors had advised it as essential for the sake of my mother's failing health, slow victim of the dread tubercular scourge. But my father had always had a strong yearning for clear skies, year-round heat, and the primeval sea, a deep conviction that his destiny somehow lay west and was involved with Earth's hugest ocean, from which perhaps the moon was torn. My father's deep-seated longing for this outwardly wholesome and bright, inwardly sinister and eaten-away landscape, where nature herself prevents the naive face of youth masking the corruptions of age, has given me much food for thought, though it is in no way a remarkable longing. Many people migrate here, healthy as well as sick, drawn by the sun, the promise of perpetual summer, the broad if arid fields. The only unusual circumstance worthy of note is that there is a larger sprinkling than might be expected of persons of professed mystical and utopian bent. The Brothers of the Rose, the Theosophists, the Foursquare Gospelers, the Christian Scientists, Unity, the Brotherhood of the Grail, the Spiritualists, the Astrologers, all are here, and many more besides. Believers in the need of return to primitive states and primitive wisdoms, practitioners of pseudo-disciplines dictated by pseudo-sciences. Yes, even a few overly sociable hermits. One finds them everywhere. The majority awaken only my pity and distaste. So lacking in logic and avid for publicity are they. At no time, and let me emphasize this, have I been at all interested in their doings and in their ignorantly parroted principles, except possibly from the viewpoint of comparative psychology. And they were brought here by that excessive love of sunlight which characterizes most faddists of any sort, and that urge to find an unsettled, unorganized land in which utopias might take root and burgeon, untroubled by urbane ridicule and tradition-bred opposition. The same urge that led the Mormons to desert-guarded Salt Lake City, their paradise of Deseret. This seems an adequate explanation, even without bringing in the fact that Los Angeles, a city of retired farmers and small merchants, a city made hectic by the presence of the uncouth motion picture industry, would naturally attract charlatans of all varieties. Yes, that explanation is still sufficient to me, and I am rather pleased. For even now I should hate to think that those hideously alluring voices amutter with secrets from beyond the rim of the cosmos necessarily have some dim, continent-wide range. The carven rim, they are saying now here in my study. The proto-Shoggoths, the diagrammed corridor, the elder pharaohs, the dreams of Cthulhu, settling my mother and myself at a comfortable Hollywood boarding house, where the activities of the infant film industry provided us with colorful distraction. My father tramped the hills in search of a suitable property, bringing to bear his formidable talent for locating underground water and desirable rock formations. During this period, it occurs to me now, he almost certainly pioneered those trails which it is my own invariable and ever more compulsive wont to walk. Within 3 months he had found and purchased the property he sought near a predominantly Alsatian and French settlement, a scatter of bungalows no more, bearing the perhaps exaggeratedly picturesque name, Vulture's Roost, redolent of the Old West. Clearing the excavation of the property revealed an upthrust stratum of fine-grained solid metamorphic rock, while a little boring provided an excellent well, to the incredulous astonishment of his initially hostile neighbors. My father kept his counsel and began, mostly with his own hands alone, to erect a brick structure of moderate size that, by its layout and plans, promised a dwelling of surpassing beauty. This occasioned more head-shaking and lectures on the unwisdom of building brick structures in a region where earthquakes were not unknown. They call it Fisher's Folly, I learned later. Little did they realize my father's skill and the tenacity of his masonry. He bought a small truck and scoured the area as far south as Laguna Beach and as far north as Malibu, searching for the kilns that would provide him with bricks and tiles of requisite quality. In the end, he sheathed the roof partly with copper, which has turned a beautiful green with the years. During these searches, he became closely acquainted with the visionary and remarkably progressive Abbot Kinney, who was building the resort of Venice on the coast 10 miles away, and with the swarthy, bright-eyed unknown master builder, Simon Rhodia, self-educated like himself. All 3 men shared a rich vein of the poetry of stone, ceramics, and metals. There must have been prodigious reserves of strength in the old man, for my father was that now, his hair whitely grizzled, to enable him to accomplish so much hard labor, for within 2 years my mother and I were able to move into our new home at Vulture's Roost and take up our lives there. I was delighted with my new surroundings, and to be rejoined with my father, and only resentful of the time I must spend at school, to which my father drove me and from which he fetched me each day. I especially enjoyed rambling, occasionally with my father, but chiefly by myself, through the wild, dry, rock-crowned hills, spry despite my twisted foot. My mother was fearful for me, especially because of the hairy brown and black tarantulas one sometimes encountered, and the snakes, including venomous rattlers, but I was not to be restrained. My father was happy, but also like a man in a dream as he worked unceasingly at the innumerable tasks, chiefly artistic, involved in finishing our home. It was a structure of rich beauty, though our neighbors continued to shake their heads and cluck dubiously at its hexagonal shape, partly rounded roof, thick walls of tightly mortared, though unreinforced, brick, and the area of brightly colored tile and floridly engraved stone. "Fisher's folly," they'd whisper and chuckle. But swarthy Simon Rhodia nodded approvingly when he visited, and once Abbot Kinney came to admire, driven in an expensive car by a black chauffeur with whom he seemed on terms of easy friendship. My father's stone engravings were indeed quite fanciful and even a little disconcerting in their subject matter and location. One was in the basement's floor of natural rock, which he had smoothed. From time to time I'd watch him work on it. Desert plants and serpents seemed to be its subject matter, but as one studied it, one became aware that there was much marine stuff too. Serrated looping seaweeds, coiling eels, fishes that trailed tentacles, suckered octopus arms, and two giant squid eyes peering from a coral-crusted castle. And in its midst he boldly hewed in a flowery stone script, "The Gate of Dreams." My childish imagination was fired, but I was a little frightened, too. It was about this time, 1921 or thereabouts, that my sleepwalking began, or at any rate showed signs of becoming disturbingly persistent. Several times my father found me at varying distances from the house along one of the paths I favored in my limping rambles, and carried me tenderly back, chilled and shivering, for unlike Kentucky in summer, Southern California nights are surprisingly cold. And more than once I was found huddled and still asleep in our cellar, alongside the grotesquely floor-set Gate of Dreams bas-relief to which, incidentally, my mother had taken a dislike which she tried to conceal from my father. At that time, too, my sleeping habits began to show other abnormalities, some of them contradictory. Although an active and apparently healthy boy of 10, I was still sleeping infancy's 12 hours or more a night. Yet despite this unusual length of slumber coupled with the restlessness my sleepwalking would seem to have indicated, I never dreamed, or at any rate remembered dreams upon awakening. And with one notable exception, this has been true for my entire life. The exception occurred a little later on, when I was 11 or 12, in 1923 or thereabouts. I remember those few dreams, there were no more than 8 or 9 of them, with matchless vividness. How else? Since they were my life's only ones and since. But I must not anticipate. At the time I was secretive about them, telling neither my father nor my mother, as if for fear my parents might worry or, children are odd, disapprove, until one final night. In my dream, I would find myself making my way through low passages and tunnels, all crudely cut or perhaps gnawed from solid rock. Often I felt I was at a great distance under the earth, though why I thought this in my dream I cannot say, except that there was often a sensation of heat and an indescribable feeling of pressure from above. This last sensation was diminished almost to nothing at times, though, and sometimes I felt there were vast amounts of water far above me, though why I suspected this I cannot say, for the strange tunnels were always very dry. Yet in my dreams I came to assume that the burrows extended limitlessly under the Pacific. There was no obvious source of illumination in the passages. My dream explanation of how I then managed to see them was fantastic, though rather ingenious. The floor of the tunnels was colored a strange purplish green. This I explained in my dream as being the reflection of cosmic rays, which were much in the newspapers then, firing my boyish imagination, that came down through the thick rock above from distant-most outer space. The rounded ceiling of the tunnels, on the other hand, had a weird orange-blue glow. This, I seem to know, was caused by the reflection of certain rays unknown to science, that came up through the solid rock from the Earth's incandescent, constricted core. The eerie mixed light revealed to me the strange engravings or ridgy pictures everywhere covering the tunnel's walls. They had a strong suggestion of the marine to them, and also of the monstrous. Yet they were strangely generalized, as if they were the mathematical diagrams of oceans and their denizens and of whole universes of alien life. If the dreams of a monster of supernatural mentality could be given visual shape, then they would be much like those endless forms I saw on the tunnel's walls. Or if the dreams of such a monster were half materialized and able to move through such tunnels, they would shape the walls in such fashion. At first in my dreams I was not conscious of having a body. It seemed to be a viewpoint floating along the tunnels at a definitely rhythmic rate, now faster, now slower. And at first I never saw anything in those tormenting tunnels, though I was continually conscious of a fear that I might, a fear mixed with a desire. This was a most disturbing and exhausting feeling, which I could hardly have concealed upon awakening, save that, with one exception, I never woke until my dream had played itself out, as it were, and my feelings were temporarily exhausted. And then, in my next dream, I did begin to see things. Creatures, in the tunnels, floating through them in the same general rhythmic fashion as I, or my viewpoint, progressed. They were worms about as long as a man and as thick as a man's thigh, cylindrical and untapering. From end to end, as many as a centipede's legs, were pairs of tiny wings, translucent like a fly's, which vibrated unceasingly, producing an unforgettably sinister low-pitched hum. They had no eyes. Their heads were one circular mouth lined with rows of triangular teeth like a shark's. Although blind, they seemed able to sense each other at short distances, and their sudden lurching swerves then to avoid colliding with each other held a particular horror for me. It was a little like my lurching limp. In my very next dream, I became aware of my own dream body. In brief, I was myself one of those same winged worms. The horror I felt was extreme. Yet once more the dream lasted until its intensity was damped out and I could awaken with only the memory of terror, still able, I thought, to keep my dreams a secret. The next time I had my dream, it was to see 3 of the winged worms writhing in a wider section of tunnel where the sensation of pressure from above was minimal. I was still observer rather than participant, floating in my worm body in a narrower side passageway. How I was able to see while in one of the blind worm bodies, my dream logic did not explain. They were worrying a rather small human victim. Their 3 snouts converged upon and covered his face. Their sinister buzzing had a hungry note, and there were sucking sounds. Blonde hair, white pajamas, and projecting from the right leg of those, a foot slightly shrunken and twisted sharply inward, told me the victim was myself. At that instant I was shaken violently. The scene swam, and through it my mother's huge terrorized face peered down at me with my father's anxious visage close behind. I went into convulsions of terror, flailing my limbs, and I screamed and screamed. It was hours literally before I could be quieted down, and days before my father let me tell them my nightmare. Thereafter he made a strict rule that no one ever tried to shake me awake, no matter how bad a nightmare I seemed to be having. Later I learned he'd watch me at such times with knitted brow, suppressing the impulse to rouse me and seeing to it that no one else tried to do so. For several nights thereafter I fought sleep. But when my nightmare was never repeated, and once more I could never remember having dreamed at all when I wakened, I quieted down, and my life both sleeping and waking, became very tranquil again. In fact, even my sleepwalking became less frequent, although I continued to sleep for abnormally long hours, a practice now encouraged by my father's injunction that I never be wakened unnaturally. But I have since come to wonder whether this apparent diminishment of my unconscious night wandering were not because I, or some fraction of me, had become more cunningly deceitful. Habits have, in any case, a way of slipping slowly from the serious notice of those around. At times, though, I would catch my father looking at me speculatively, as though he would have dearly liked to talk with me of various deep matters. But in the end, he would always restrain this impulse, if I had divined it rightly, and content himself with encouraging me in my school studies and rambling exercise, despite the latter's dangers. There were more rattlesnakes about my favorite paths, perhaps because opossums and raccoons were being exterminated. He made me wear high-laced shoes of stout leather, and once or twice I got the impression that he and Simon Rhodia were talking secretly about me when the latter visited. On the whole, my life was a lonely one, and has remained so to this day. We had no neighbors who were friends, no friends who were neighbors. At first, this was because of the relative isolation of our residence, and the suspicion that Germanic names uniformly called forth in the years following the World War. But it continued, even after we began to have more neighbors, tolerant newcomers. Perhaps things would have been different if my father had lived longer. His health was good, save for a touch of eye strain, dancing colors he'd see briefly. But that was not to be. On that fatal Sunday in 1925, he had joined me on one of my customary walks, and we had just reached one of my favorite spots when the ground gave way under his feet, and he vanished from beside me. His startled exclamation dropped in pitch as he fell rapidly. For once, his instinct for underground conditions had deserted him. There was a little scraping rumble as a few rocks and some gravel landslided. Then silence. I approached the weed-fringed black hole on my belly and peered down fearfully. From very far below, it sounded. I heard my father call faintly, "Georg, get help!" His voice now had a strained, higher-pitched sound, as if his chest were being constricted. "Father, I'm coming down," I cried, cupping my hands about my mouth, and I had thrust my twisted foot into the hole, searching for support, when his frantic yet clearly enunciated words came up, his voice still higher-pitched and even more strained, as if he had to make a great effort to get sufficient breath for them. "Do not come down, Georg. You'll start an avalanche. Get help. A rope." After a moment's hesitation, I withdrew my leg and set off for home at a hobbling gallop. My horror was heightened, or perhaps a little relieved, by a sense of the dramatic. Early that year, we had listened for weeks on the little crystal set I'd built to the radioed reports of the long-protracted, exciting efforts, ultimately unsuccessful, to rescue Floyd Collins from where he'd got himself trapped in Sand Cave near Cave City, Kentucky. I suppose I anticipated some such drama for my father. Most fortunately, a young doctor was making a call in our neighborhood, and he was foremost in the party of men I soon guided back to where my father had disappeared. No sounds at all came from the black hole, although we called, and I remember that a couple of men had begun to look at me dubiously, as if I'd invented the whole thing. When the courageous young doctor insisted, against the advice of most, on being lowered into the hole, they'd brought a strong rope and an electric flashlight. He was a long time going down, descending about 50 feet in all, while calls went back and forth, and almost as long being drawn up. When he emerged, all smeared and sandy dirt, great orange smudges. It was to tell us. He made a point of laying his hand on my shoulder. I could see my mother hurrying up between two other women. That my father was inextricably wedged in down there, with little more than his head exposed, and that he was, to an absolute certainty, dead. At that moment there was another grating rumble, and the black hole collapsed upon itself. One of the men standing on its edge was barely jerked to safety. My mother shrieked, threw herself down on the shaking brown weeds, and was drawn back too. In the subsequent weeks, it was decided that my father's body could not be recovered. Some bags of concrete and sand were dumped into what was left of the hole to seal it. My mother was forbidden to erect a monument at the spot, but in some sort of compensation, I didn't understand the logic of it. Los Angeles County presented her with a cemetery plot elsewhere. It now holds her own body. An unofficial funeral service conducted by a Latin American priest was eventually held at the spot, and Simon Rodia, defying the injunction, put up a small, non-sectarian ovoid monument of his own matchlessly tough white concrete, bearing my father's name, and beautifully inset with a vaguely aquatic or naval design in fragmented blue and green glass. It is still there. After my father's death, I became more withdrawn and brooding than ever, and my mother, a shy, consumptive woman full of hysterical fears, hardly encouraged me to become sociable. In fact, almost as long as I can remember, and certainly ever since Anton Fisher's tragic and abrupt demise, nothing has ever bulked large with me save my own brooding and this brick house, set in the hills with its strange, queerly set stone carvings and the hills themselves. Those sandy, spongy, salt-soaked, sun-baked hills. There has been altogether too much of them in my background. I have limped too long along their crumbling rims, under their cracked and treacherous overhanging sandstones, and through the months-dry streams that thread their separating canyons. I have thought a great deal about the old days when some Indians are said to have believed the strangers came down from the stars with the great meteor shower, and the lizard men perished in the course of their frantic digging for water, and the scaly sea men came tunneling in from their encampments beneath the vast Pacific, which constituted a whole world to the west, extensive as that of the stars. I early developed too great a love for such savage fancies. Too much of my physical landscape has become the core of my mental landscape, and during the nights of my long, long sleepings, I hobbled through them both, I'm somehow sure. While by day I had horrible fugitive visions of my father, underground, dead alive, accompanied by the winged worms of my nightmare. Moreover, I developed the notion or fantasy that there was a network of tunnels underlying the paths I limped along, and corresponding to them exactly, but at varying depths and coming closest to the surface at my favorite spots. The legend of Yig, the voices are droning. The violet wisps, the globular nebulas, Canis Tindalos and their foul essence, the nature of the Doels, the tinted chaos, great Kutlu's minions. I've made breakfast, but I cannot eat. I thirstily gulp hot coffee. I would hardly keep harping on my sleepwalking, and on the unnaturally long hours I spent so deeply asleep that my mother would vow that my mind was elsewhere, were it not associated with a lapse in the intellectual promise I was said to have shown in earlier years. True, I got along well enough in the semi-rural grade school I trudged to, and later in the suburban high school to which a bus took me. True, too, that I early showed interest in many subjects and flashes of excellent logic and imaginative reasoning. The trouble was that I did not seem ever able to pursue any of those flashes, and make a steady and persistent effort. There would be times when my teachers would worry my mother with reports of my unpreparedness and my disregard of assignments. Though when examination time came, I almost invariably managed to make a creditable showing. My interests in more personal directions, too, seemed to peter out very quickly. I was certainly peculiarly deficient in the power of attention. I remember often sitting down with a favorite book or text and then finding myself, minutes or hours later, turning over pages far ahead of anything I could remember reading. Sometimes only the memory of my father's injunctions to study deeply, would keep me prodding on. You may not think this matter worth mentioning. There is nothing strange in a lonely, sheltered child failing to show great willpower and mental energy. There is nothing strange in such a child becoming slothful, weak, and indecisive. Nothing strange, only much to pity and reproach. The powers that be know I reproached myself often enough, for as my father had encouraged me to, I felt a power and a capability somewhere in myself, but somehow inhibited. But there are only too many people with power they cannot loose. It is only later events that have made me see something significant in my lapsings. My mother followed to the letter my father's directions for my higher education, which I only learned of now. Upon my graduation from high school, I was sent to a venerable Eastern institution of learning not as well known as those of the Ivy League, but of equally high standing, Miskatonic University, which lies on the serpentine river of that name within the antique town of Arkham with its gambrel roofs and elm-shaded avenues quiet as the footsteps of a witch's familiar. My father had first heard of the school from an Eastern employer of his talents, a Harley Warren, for whom he had done some unusual dowsing in a cemetery within a swamp of cypresses, and that man's high praise of Miskatonic had imprinted itself indelibly upon his memory. My previous school record did not permit of this. I lacked certain prerequisites, but I just barely managed, much to my surprise of all my previous teachers, to pass a stiff entrance examination which required, like that of Dartmouth, some knowledge of Greek as well as Latin. Only I knew how much furious, imagination-invoking guessing that took. I could not bear to fall utterly short of my father's hopes for me. Unfortunately, my efforts were in vain. Before the first term ended, I was back in Southern California, physically and mentally depleted by a series of attacks of nervousness, homesickness, actual ailment, anemia, an increase in the hours I devoted to sleep, and an almost incredible recurrence of my sleepwalking, which more than once carried me deep into the wild hills west of Arkham. I tried for what seemed to me a long time to stick it out, but was advised by the college doctors to give it up after some particularly bad attacks. I believe that they thought I was not cut out to be even a moderately strong individual, and that they pitied me more than they sympathized with me. It is not a good thing to see a youth racked by sentiments and longings proper to a fearful child. And they appeared to be right in this, although I know now that they were wrong, for my malady turned out, apparently, to be simple homesickness and nothing more. It was with a feeling of immense relief that I returned to my mother and our brick home in the hills. And with each room I re-entered, I gained more assurance, even, or perhaps especially, the cellar, with its well-swept floor of solid rock, my father's tools and chemicals, acids, etc., and the marinely decorated floor-set rock inscription, the Gate of Dreams. It was as though all the time I had been at Miskatonic, there had been an invisible leash dragging me back, and only now had its pressure slackened completely. Those voices are continent-wide, of course. The essential salts, the fane of Dagon, the grey, twisted, brittle monstrosity, the flute-tormented pandemonium, the coral-encrusted towers of Roulé, and the hills helped me as much as my home. For a month I roamed them daily, and walked the old familiar paths between the parched and browning undergrowth, my mind full of old tales and scraps of childhood brooding. I think it was only then, only with my returning, that I first came fully to realize how much, and a little of what, those hills meant to me. From Mount Waterman and steep Mount Wilson, with its great observatory and 100-inch reflector, down through cavernous Tujunga Canyon, with its many sinuous offshoots to the flatlands, and then across the squat Verdugo Hills, and the closer ones with Griffith Observatory and its lesser scopes, to sinister, almost inaccessible Potrero, and great twisting Topanga canyons that open with the abruptness of catastrophe upon the monstrous, primeval Pacific. All of them, the hills, with few exceptions, sandy, cracked, and treacherous, the earth like rock, and the rock like dried earth, rotten, crumbling, and porous. All this had such a hold on me, the limper, the fearful listener, as to be obsessive. And indeed there were more and more symptoms of obsession now. I favored certain paths over others for ill-defined reasons, and there were places I could not pass without stopping for a little. My fantasy or notion became stronger than ever, that there were tunnels under the paths, traveled by beings which attracted the venomous snakes of the outer world, because they were akin to them. Could some eerie reality have underlaid my childhood nightmare? I shied away from that thought. All this, as I say, I realized during the month after my defeated return from the East. And at the end of that month, I resolved to conquer my obsession, and my revolting homesickness, and all the subtle weaknesses and inner hindrances that kept me from being the man my father had dreamed of. I had found that a complete break such as my father had planned for me, miskatonic, would not work. So I determined to work out my troubles without running away. I would take courses at nearby UCLA, the University of California at Los Angeles. I would study and exercise, build up both body and mind. I remember that my determination was intense. There is something very ironic about that, for my plan, logical as it seemed, was the one sure course to further psychological entrapment. For some time, however, I seemed to be getting on successfully. With systematic exercise and better controlled diet and rest, still my 12 hours a night, I became healthier than I ever had been before. All the troubles that had beset me in the East vanished completely away. No longer did I wake shuddering from my dreamless sleepwalking. In fact, as far as I could determine at the time, that habit had gone for good. And at college, from which I returned home nightly, I made steady progress. It was then that I first began to write those imaginative and pessimistic poems, tinged with metaphysical speculation, that have won me some little attention from a small circle of readers. Oddly, they were sparked by the one significant item I had brought back with me from shadow-beset Arkham, a little book of verse I'd bought at a dusty second-hand store there. Azathoth and Other Horrors, by Edward Pickman Derby, a local poet. Now I know that my spurt of new effort during my college years was largely deceptive, because I had decided upon a new course of life that brought me into a few new situations, though keeping me at home. I thought I was progressing vastly. I managed to keep on believing that for all my college years, that I could never study any subject profoundly, that I could never create anything that took a protracted effort. I explained by telling myself that what I was doing was preparation and intellectual orientation for some great future effort. For several years I managed to conceal from myself the fact that I could only call a tithe of my energy my own, while the residuum was being shunted down only the powers that be know what inner channels. I thought I knew what books I was studying, but the voices now are telling me the runes of Nogsoth, the clavicle of Nyarlathotep, the litanies of Lomar, the secular meditations of Pierre-Louis Montagny, the Necronomicon, the chants of Kram Ya, the overviews of Yang Li. It is midday, or later outside, but the house is cool. I've managed to eat a little and made more coffee. I've been down to the basement, checking my father's tools and things, his sledge, carboys of acid, etc., and looking at the Gate of Dreams and treading softly. The voices are strongest there. Suffice it that during my 6 college and poetic years, I couldn't carry a full load of courses. I lived not as a man, but as a fraction of a man. I had gradually given up all grand ambitions and become content to lead a life in miniature. I spent my time going to easy classes, writing fragments of prose and an occasional poem, caring for my mother, who, except for her worries about me, was undemanding, and for my father's house, so well built it needed hardly any care, rambling almost absent-mindedly in the hills, and sleeping prodigiously. I had no friends. In fact, we had no friends. Abbot Kinney had died, and Los Angeles had stolen his Venice. Simon Rhodia gave up his visits, for he was now totally preoccupied with his great single-handed building project. Once on my mother's urging, I went to Watts, a settlement of flower-decked humble bungalows dwarfed by his fabulous backyard towers that were rising like a blue-green Persian dream. He had trouble recalling who I was, and then he watched me strangely as he worked. The money my father had left, in silver dollars, was ample for my mother and myself. In short, I had become, not unpleasantly, resigned. This was all the easier for me because of my growing absorption in the doctrines of such men as Oswald Spengler, who believe that culture and civilization go by cycles, and that our own Faustian Western world, with all its grandiose dream of scientific progress, is headed toward a barbarism that will engulf it as surely as the Goths, Vandals, Scythians, and Huns engulfed mighty Rome, and her longer-lived sister, dwindling Byzantium. As I looked from my hilltops down on bustling Los Angeles, always a building, I placidly thought of the future days when little bands of blustering, ill-kempt barbarians will walk the streets of humped and pitted asphalt, and look on each of its ruined, many-purposed buildings as just another hut, when high-set Griffith Park Planetarium, romantically rock-built, high-walled, and firmly bastioned, will be the stronghold of some petty dictator, when industry and science will be gone and all their machines and instruments rusted and broken, and their use forgotten, and all our works forgotten as completely as those of the sunken civilization of Mu in the Pacific, of the fragments of whose cities only remain Nan Matol and Rapa Nui, or Easter Island. But whence did these thoughts really come? Not entirely, or even principally from Spengler, I'll be bound. No, they had a deeper source, I greatly fear. Yet thus I thought, thus I believed, and thus I was wooed away from the pursuits and tempting goals of our commercial world. I saw everything in terms of transiency, decadence, and decline, as if the times were as rotten and crumbling as the hills which obsessed me. It was that I was convinced, not that I was morbid. No, my health was better than ever, and I was neither bored nor dissatisfied. Oh, I occasionally berated myself for failure to manifest the promise my father had seen in me, but on the whole I was strangely content. I had a weird sense of power and self-satisfaction, as if I were a man in the midst of some engrossing pursuit. You know the pleasant relief and bone-deep satisfaction that comes after a day of successful hard work? Well, that was the way I felt almost all the time, day in and day out. and I took my happiness as a gift of the gods. It did not occur to me to ask, which gods? Are they from heaven or from the underworld? Even my mother was happier, her disease arrested, her son devoted to her and leading a busy life, on a very small scale, and doing nothing to worry her beyond his occasional rambles in the snake-infested hills. Fortune smiled on us. Our brick dwelling rode out the severe Long Beach earthquake of March 10, 1933, without sustaining the least damage. Those who still called it Fisher's Folly were nonplussed. Last year, 1936, I duly received from UCLA my bachelor's diploma in English literature, with a minor in history, my mother proudly attending the ceremony. And a month or so later she seemed as childishly delighted as I at the arrival of the first bound copies of my little book of verse, The Tunneler Below, printed at my own expense. And in my hubristic mood of auctorial conceit, I not only sent out several copies for review, but also donated two to the UCLA library and two more to that at Miskatonic. In my covering letter to the erudite Dr. Henry Armitage, librarian at the latter institution, I mentioned not only my brief attendance there, but also my inspiration by an Arkham poet. I also told him a little about the circumstances of my composition of the poems. I joked deprecatingly to my mother about this last expansive gesture of mine, but she knew how deeply I had been hurt by my failure at Miskatonic and how strongly I desired to repair my reputation there. So when only a few weeks later a letter came addressed to me and bearing the Arkham postmark, she hurried out into the hills quite against her usual wont to bring it to me, I having just gone out on one of my rambles. From where I was, I barely heard, yet also recognized her mortal screams. I rushed back at my most desperate, limping speed. At the very spot where my father had perished, I found her writhing on the hard, dry ground, and screaming still, and near to her and whipping about, the large, young rattlesnake that had bitten her on the calf, which was already swelling. I killed the horrid thing with the stick I carry, then slashed the bite with my sharp pocket-knife, and sucked it out and injected anti-venom from the kit I have always with me on my walks, all to no avail. She died 2 days later in the hospital. Once more there was not only shock and depression, but also the dismal business of a funeral to get through. At least we already owned a grave lot. This time a more conventional ceremony, but this time I was wholly alone. It was a week before I could bring myself to look at the letter she'd been bringing me. After all, it had been the cause of her death. I almost tore it up unread. But after I had got into it, I became more and more interested and then incredulously amazed and frightened. Here it is in its entirety. 118 Saltonstall Street, Arkham, Massachusetts, August 12, 1936. Georg Reuter Fisher, Esquire, Vulture's Roost, Hollywood, California. My dear sir, Dr. Henry Armitage took the liberty of letting me peruse your The Tunneler Below before it was placed on general circulation in the University Library. May one who serves only in the outer court of the Muses' temple, and particularly outside Polyhymnia's and Eratos' shrines, be permitted to express his deep appreciation of your creative achievement, and to tender respectfully the like admirations of Professor Wingate Peasley of our psychology department, and of Dr. Francis Morgan of medicine and comparative anatomy, who share my special interests, and of Dr. Armitage himself. The Green Deeps is in particular a remarkably well-sustained and deeply moving lyric poem. I am an assistant professor of literature at Miskatonic, and an enthusiastic amateur student of New England and other folklore. If memory serves, you were in my freshman English section 6 years ago. I was sorry then that the state of your health forced you to curtail your studies, and I am happy now to have before me conclusive evidence that you have completely surmounted all such difficulties. Congratulations. And now will you allow me to pass on to another and very different matter, which is nonetheless peripherally related to your poetic work. Miskatonic is currently engaged in a broad, interdepartmental research in the general area of folklore, language, and dreams, an investigation of the vocabulary of the collective unconscious, particularly as it expresses itself in poetry. The three scholars I have alluded to are among those active in this work, along with persons in Brown University, Providence, Rhode Island, who are carrying on the pioneering work of the late Professor George Gamel Angel, and from time to time I am honored to render them assistance. They have empowered me to ask you for your own help in this matter, which could be of signal importance. It is a matter of answering a few questions only, relating to the accidents of your writing and in no way impinging on its essence, and should not cut seriously into your time. Naturally, any information you choose to supply will be treated as strictly confidential. I call your attention to the following 2 lines in The Green Deeps. Intelligence doth grow itself within, the coral-palled, squat towers of Roulet. Did you, in composing this poem, ever consider a more eccentric spelling of the last, and presumably invented, word? Rillier, say. And going back 3 lines, did you consider spelling nath, invented, with an initial P, i.e. Panav? Also in the same poem, the rampant dragon dreams in far Cathay, while snake-limbed Kutlu sleeps in deep Roulet. The name Kutlu, once more invented, is of considerable interest to us. Did you have phonetic difficulty in choosing the letters to represent the sound you had in mind? Did you perhaps simplify in the interests of poetic clarity? At any time did Cthulhu ever occur to you? As you can see, we are discovering that the language of the collective unconscious is almost unpleasantly guttural and sibilant, all hawking and spitting like German. Also, there is this quatrain in your impressive lyric, Sea Tombs. Their spires underlie our deepest graves, lit are they by a light that man has seen. Only the wingless worm can go between our daylight and their vault beneath the waves. Were there some proofreading errors here, or the equivalent? Specifically, in the second line, should that be no? And was the light you had in mind what you might call orange-blue, or purple-green, or both? And in the next line, how does winged rather than wingless strike you? Finally, in regard to Sea Tombs, and also the title poem of your book, Professor Peasley has a question which he calls a long shot about the subterranean and submarine tunnels which you evoke. Did you ever have fantasies of such tunnels really existing in the area where you composed the poem? The Hollywood Hills and Santa Monica Mountains, presumably, the Pacific Ocean being nearby. Did you perhaps try actually to trace the paths overlying these fancied tunnels? And did you happen to notice, excuse the strangeness of this question, an unusual number of venomous serpents along such routes? Rattlers, I would presume. In our area it would be copperheads, and in the south water moccasins and coral snakes. If so, do take care. If such tunnels should by some strange coincidence actually exist, it would be scientifically possible to confirm the fact without any digging or drilling, or by discovering an existent opening. It may interest you to know, even vacuity, i.e. nothing, leaves its traces, it appears. 2 Miskatonic science professors, who are part of the interdepartmental program I mentioned, have devised a highly portable apparatus for the purpose, which they call a magneto-optic geoscanner. That last hybrid word must sound a most clumsy and barbarous coinage to a poet, I'm sure. But you know scientists. It is strange, is it not, to think of an investigation of dreams having geological repercussions. The clever, though infelicitously named instrument is a simplified adaptation of one which has already discovered 2 new elements. I shall be making a trip west early next year to confer with a man in San Diego who happens to be the son of the scholarly recluse whose research is led to our interdepartmental program, Henry Wentworth Akeley, the local poet, alas deceased, to whom you pay such generous tribute, was another such pioneer, it happens oddly. I shall be driving my own British sports car, a diminutive Austin. I am something of an automobile maniac, I must confess, even a speed demon. However inappropriate that may be for an assistant English professor. I would be very pleased to make your further acquaintance at that time, if entirely agreeable to you. I might even bring along a geoscanner and we could check out those hypothetical tunnels. But I perhaps anticipate and presume too far. Pardon me. I will be very grateful for any attention you are able to give this letter and its necessarily impertinent questions. Once more, congratulations on The Tunneler. Yours very truly, Albert N. Wilmarth. It is quite impossible to describe all at once my state of mind when I finished reading this letter. I can only do so by stages. To begin with, I was flattered and gratified, even acutely embarrassed by his apparently sincere praise of my verses, as what young poet wouldn't be, and that a psychologist and an old librarian, even an anatomist, should admire them too. It was almost too much. As soon as the man mentioned freshman English, I realized that I had a vivid memory of him. Although I'd forgotten his name in the course of years, it came back to me like a shot when I glanced ahead at the end of the letter and saw it. He had been only an instructor then, a tall young man, cadaverously thin, always moving about with nervous rapidity, his shoulders hunched. He had a long jaw and a pale complexion, with dark-circled eyes which gave him a haunted look, as if he were constantly under some great strain to which he never alluded. He had the habit of jerking out a little notebook and making jottings without ceasing for a moment to discourse fluently, even brilliantly. He seemed incredibly well-read, and had had a lot to do with stimulating and deepening my interest in poetry. I even remembered his car. The other students used to joke about it with an undercurrent of envy. It had been a Model T Ford then, which he'd always driven at a brisk clip around the fringes of the Miskatonic campus, taking turns very sharply. The program of interdepartmental research he described sounded very impressive, even exciting, but eminently plausible. I was just discovering Young then, and also semantics, and to be invited so graciously to take part in it, once again, I was flattered. If I hadn't been alone while I read it, I might have blushed. One notion I got then did stop me briefly, and for a moment almost turned me angrily against the whole thing. The sudden suspicion that the purpose of the program might not be the avowed one, that the presence in it of a psychologist and a medical doctor influenced me in this. It was some sort of investigation of the delusions of crankish, imaginative people, not so much the incidental insights as the psychopathology of poets. But he was so very gracious and reasonable. No, I was being paranoid, I told myself. Besides, as soon as I got a ways into his detailed questions, it was an altogether different reaction that filled me. One of utter amazement. And fear. For starters, he was so incredibly accurate in his guesses. For what else could they possibly be, I asked myself uneasily, about those invented names that he had me gasping. I had first thought of spelling them Rillier and Panath. Exactly those letters. Though of course memory can be tricky about such things. And then that Cthulhu. Seeing it spelled that way actually made me shiver. It so precisely conveyed the deep-pitched, harsh, inhuman cry or chant I'd imagined coming up from profound black abysses, and only finally rendered as Cthulhu rather dubiously, but fearing anything more complex would seem affectation. And really, you can't fit the inner rhythms of a sound like Cthulhu into English poetry. And then to find that he'd spotted those two proofreaders' errors, for they'd been just that. The first I'd missed, the second, wingless for winged, I caught, but then rather spinelessly let stand, feeling all of a sudden that I'd perpetuated something overly fantastic when I'd put a figure from my life's one nightmare, a worm with wings, into a poem. And topping even that, how in the name of all that's wonderful could he have described unearthly colors I'd only dreamed of and never put into my poems at all, using exactly the same color words I'd used? I began to think that Miskatonic's interdepartmental research project must have made some epical discoveries about dreams and dreaming and the human imagination in general, enough to turn their scholars into wizards and dumbfound Adler, Freud, and even Jung. At that point in my reading of the letter, I thought he'd hit me with everything he possibly could. But the next section managed to mine a still deeper source of horror, and one most disturbingly close to everyday reality. That he should know, somehow deduce, all about my paths in the hills and my odd daydreams about them and about tunnels I'd fancied underlying them, that was truly staggering. And that he should ask and even warn me about venomous snakes, so that the very letter my mother was carrying unopened when she got her death sting contained a vital reference to it. Really, for a moment and more then, I did wonder if I were going insane. And finally, when despite all his jaunty fancieds and long shots and hypotheticals and English professor witticisms, he began to talk as if he assumed my imaginary tunnels were real, and to refer lightly to a scientific instrument that would prove it. Well, by the time I'd finished his letter, I fully expected him to turn up the next minute, turn in sharply at our drive with a flourish of wheels and brakes in his Model T, no, Austin, and draw up in a cloud of dust at our door, the geoscanner sitting on the front seat beside him like a fat black telescope directed downward. And yet he'd been so damnably breezy about it all. I simply didn't know what to think. I've been down in the basement again, checking things out. This writing stirs me up and makes me frightfully restless. I went out front, and there was a rattlesnake crossing the path in the hot, slanting sunlight from the west. More evidence, if any were needed, that what I fear is true. Or do I hope for it? At all events, I killed the brute. The voices vibrate with the half-born worlds, the alien orbs, the stirrings in blackness, the hooded forms, the nighted depths, the shimmering vortices, the purple haze. When I'd calmed down somewhat next day, I wrote Wilmarth a long letter, confirming all his hints, confessing my utter astonishment at them and begging him to explain how he'd made them. I volunteered to assist the interdepartmental project in any way I could, and invited him to be my guest when he came west. I gave him a brief history of my life and my sleep anomalies, mentioning my mother's death. I had a strange feeling of unreality as I posted the letter, and waited with mixed feelings of impatience and lingering, and also regathering incredulity for his reply. When it came, quite a fat one, it rekindled all my first excitement, though without satisfying all my curiosity by any means. Wilmarth was still inclined to write off his and his colleagues' deductions about my word choices, dreams, and fantasies as lucky guesses, though he told me enough about the project to keep my curiosity in a fever. especially about its discoveries of obscure linkages between the life of the imagination and archaeological discoveries in far-off places. He seemed particularly interested in the fact that I generally never dreamed, and that I slept for very long hours. He overflowed with thanks for my cooperation and my invitation, promising to include me in his itinerary when he drove west. And he had a lot more questions for me. The next months were strange ones. I lived my normal life, if it can be called that, keeping up my reading and studies and library visits, even writing a little new poetry from time to time. I continued my hill ramblings, though with a new wariness. Sometimes during them I'd stop and stare at the dry earth beneath my feet, as if expecting to trace the outlines of a trap door in it. And sometimes I'd be consumed by sudden, wildly passionate feelings of grief and guilt at the thought of my father locked down there, and at my mother's horrible death too. I'd feel I must somehow go to them at all costs. And yet at the same time I was living only for Wilmarth's letters and the moods of wonder, fantastic speculation, and panic, yet almost delicious terror they evoked in me. He'd write about all sorts of things besides the project. My poetry and new readings and my ideas. He'd play the professorial mentor here from time to time. World events, the weather, astronomy, submarines, his pet cats, faculty politics at Miskatonic, town meetings at Arkham, his lectures, and the local trips he'd make. He made it all extremely interesting. Clearly he was an inveterate letter writer, and under his influence I became one too. But most of all, of course, I was fascinated by what he'd write from time to time about the project. He told me some very interesting things about the Miskatonic Antarctic expedition of 1930-31, with its 5 great Dornier airplanes and last year's somewhat abortive Australian one, in which the psychologist Peasley and his father, a one-time economist, had been involved. I remembered having read about them both in the newspapers, though the reports there had been curiously fragmentary and unsatisfying, almost as if the press were prejudiced against Miskatonic. I got the strong impression that Wilmarth would have liked very much to have accompanied both expeditions, and was very much put out at not having been able or allowed to, though most of the time bravely concealing his disappointment. More than once he referred to his unfortunate nervousness, sensitivity to cold, fierce migraine attacks, and bouts of ill health, which would put him to bed for a few days. And sometimes he'd speak with wistful admiration of the prodigious energy and stalwart constitutions of several of his colleagues, such as Professors Atwood and Pabody, the geoscanner's inventors, Dr. Morgan, who was a big game hunter, and even the octogenarian Armitage. There were occasional delays in his replies, which always filled me with anxiety and restlessness, sometimes because of these attacks of his, and sometimes because he'd been away longer than he'd expected on some visit. One of the latter was to Providence to confer with colleagues, and help investigate the death under mysterious circumstances involving a lightning bolt of Robert Blake, a poet like myself, short story writer and painter, whose work had provided much material for the project. It was just after his visit to Providence that, with a curious sort of guardedness and reluctance, he mentioned visiting another colleague of sorts there, who was in poor health, a Howard Phillips Lovecraft, who had fictionalized, but quite sensationally, Wilmarth warned me, some Arkham scandals and some of Miskatonic's researches and project activities. These stories had been published, when at all, in cheap pulp magazines, especially in a lurid journal called Weird Tales. You'll want to tear the cover off if ever you should dare to buy a copy, he assured me. I recalled having seen the magazine on downtown newsstands in Hollywood and Westwood. I hadn't found the covers offensive. Most of their nude female figures by some sentimental woman artist were decorously sleek pastels, and their activities only playfully perverse. Others, by one Senf, were a rather florid folk art quite reminiscent of my father's floral chiselings. But after that, of course, I haunted second-hand bookstores, hunting down copies of weird tales, mostly, with Lovecraft stories in them, until I'd found a few and read them. One, The Call of Cthulhu, no less. It cost me the strangest shudders, let me tell you, to see that name again, spelled out in cheapest print, under such very outlandish circumstances. Truly, my sense of reality was set all askew, and if the tale that Lovecraft told with a strange dignity and power has anything like the truth, then Cthulhu was real. An other-dimensional extraterrestrial monster dreaming in an insane Pacific sunken metropolis which sent out mental messages and, who knows, tunnels to the world at large. In another tale, The Whisperer in Darkness, Albert N. Wilmarth was a leading character, and that Akeley, too, he'd mentioned. It was all fearfully unsettling and confounding. If I hadn't attended Miskatonic myself and lived in Arkham, I'd have thought surely they were a writer's projections. As you can imagine, I continued to haunt the dusty bookstores, and I bombarded Wilmarth with frantic questions. His replies were of a most pacifying and temporizing sort. Yes, he'd been afraid of my getting too excited, but hadn't been able to resist telling me about the stories. Lovecraft often laid on things very thickly indeed. I'd understand everything much better when we could really talk together and he could explain in person. Really, Lovecraft had an extremely powerful imagination, and sometimes it got out of hand. No, Miskatonic had never tried to suppress these stories or take legal action, for fear of even less desirable publicity. And because the project members thought the stories might be a good preparation for the world if some of their more frightening hypotheses were verified. Really, Lovecraft was a very charming and well-intentioned person, but sometimes he went too far, and so on and so on. Really, I don't think I could have contained myself, except that, it now being 1937, Wilmarth sent me word that he was at last driving west. The Austin had been given a thorough overhaul and was packed to the gills with the geoscanner, endless books and papers, and other instruments and materials, including a drug Morgan had just refined, which induces dreaming and may conceivably, he says, facilitate clairvoyance and clairaudience. It might make even you dream, should you consent to ingest an experimental dose. While he was gone from 118 Saltonstall, his rooms would be occupied, and his cats, including his beloved Black Fellow, cared for by a close friend named Danforth, who'd spent the last 5 years in a mental hospital recovering from his ghastly Antarctic experience at the Mountains of Madness. Wilmarth hated to leave at this time, he wrote. In particular, he was worried about Lovecraft's failing health, but nevertheless, he was on his way. The next weeks, which dragged out to 2 months, were a time of particular tension, anxiety, and anticipatory excitement for me. Wilmarth had many more people and places to visit and investigations to make, including readings with the geoscanner, than I'd ever imagined. Now he sent mostly postcards, some of them scenic, but they came thick and fast, except for a couple of worrisome hiatuses. And with his minuscule handwriting, he got so much on them, even the scenic ones, that at times I almost felt I was with him on his trip, worrying about the innards of his Austin, which he called the Tin Hind, after Sir Francis Drake's golden one. I, on my part, had only a few addresses he'd listed for me where I could write him in advance. Baltimore, Winchester, Virginia, Bowling Green, Kentucky, Memphis, Carlsbad, New Mexico, Tucson, and San Diego. First, he had to stop in Hunterdon County, New Jersey, with its quaintly backward farm communities, to investigate some possibly pre-colonial ruins and hunt for a rumored cave using the geoscanner. Next, after Baltimore, there were extensive limestone caverns to check out in both Virginias. He crossed the Appalachians Winchester to Clarksburg, a stretch with enough sharp turns to satisfy even him. Approaching Louisville, the Tin Hind was almost swallowed up by the Great Ohio Flood, which preoccupied the radio news for days. I hung over my super heterodyne set, and he was unable to visit a new correspondent of Lovecraft there. Then there was more work for the geoscanner at Mammoth Cave. In fact, caves seemed to dominate his journey. For after a side trip to New Orleans to confer with some occult scholar of French extraction, there were the Carlsbad Caverns and nearby, but less well-known, subterranean vacuities. I wondered more and more about my tunnels. The Tin Hind held up very well, except she blew out a piston head crossing Texas. I held her at high speed a little too long, and he lost 3 days getting her mended. Meanwhile, I was finding and reading new Lovecraft stories. One, which turned up in a second-hand but quite recent science fiction pulp, fictionalized the Australian expedition most impressively, especially the dreams old Peasley had that led to it. In them, he'd exchanged personalities with a cone-shaped monster and was forever wandering through long stone passageways, haunted by invisible whistlers. It reminded me so much of my nightmares in which I'd done the same thing with a winged worm that buzzed, that I airmailed a rather desperate letter to Tucson, telling Wilmarth all about it. I got a reply from San Diego, full of reassurances and more temporizings, and referring to old Akeley's son and some sea caverns they were looking into, and, at last, setting a date, it would be soon, for his arrival. The day before that last, I made a rare find in my favorite Hollywood hunting ground. It was a little strikingly illustrated book by Lovecraft called The Shadow over Innsmouth, and issued by Visionary Press, whoever they were. I was up half the night reading it. The narrator found some sinister, scaly human beings living in a deep submarine city off New England, realized he was himself turning into one of them, and at the end had decided, for better or worse, to dive down and join them. It made me think of crazy fantasies I'd had of somehow going down into the earth beneath the Hollywood Hills and rescuing or joining my dead father. Meanwhile, mail addressed to Wilmarth, care of me, had begun to arrive. He'd asked my permission to include my address on the itinerary he'd sent other correspondents. There were letters and cards from, by their postmarks, Arkham and places along his route. Some from abroad, mostly England and Europe, but one from Argentina, and a small package from New Orleans. The return address on most of them was his own, 118 Sultanstall, so he'd eventually get them even if he missed them along his route. He'd asked me to do the same with my own notes. The effect was odd, as though Wilmarth were the author of everything. It almost re-aroused my first suspicions of him and the project. One letter, though among the last to come, a thick one bearing extravagantly a 6-cent airmail stamp and a 10-cent special delivery, had been addressed to George Goodenough Akeley, 176 Pleasant Street, San Diego, California, and then forwarded care of my own address in the upper left-hand corner. Late in the afternoon, Sunday, April 14, the eve of my 25th birthday, as it happened, Wilmarth arrived very much as I'd imagined it occurring when I'd finished reading his first letter, except the Tin Hind was even smaller than I'd pictured, and enameled a bright blue, though now most dusty. There was an odd black case on the seat beside him, though there were a lot of other things on it too. Maps, mostly. He greeted me very warmly and began to talk a blue streak almost at once, with many a jest and frequent little laughs. The thing that really shocked me was that, although I knew he was only in his 30s, his hair was white, and the haunted or hunted look I'd remembered was monstrously intensified. and he was extremely nervous. At first, he couldn't stay still a moment. It wasn't long before I became certain of something I'd never once suspected before, that his breeziness and jauntiness, his jokes and laughs, were a mask for fear. No, for sheer terror that otherwise might have mastered him entirely. His actual first words were, "Mr. Fisher, I presume. So glad to meet you in the flesh, and share your most salubrious sunlight. I look as if I need it, do I not? A horrid sight. This landscape hath a distinctly cavish, tunnely aspect. I'm getting to be an old hand at making such geological judgments. Danforth writes that Blackfellow has quite recovered from his indisposition, but Lovecraft is in the hospital. I do not like it. Did you observe last night's brilliant conjunction? I like your clear skies. No, I will carry the geoscanner. Yes, it is that. It's somewhat crankish. But you might take the small valise. Really, so very glad." He did not comment on or even seem to notice my twisted right foot, something I hadn't mentioned in my letters, though he may have recalled it from 6 years back, or imply its or my limp's existence in any way, as by insisting on carrying the valise also. That warmed me toward him. And before going into the house with me, he paused to praise its unusual architecture, another thing I hadn't told him about, and seemed genuinely impressed when I admitted that my father had built it by himself. I'd feared he'd find it overly eccentric and also question whether someone could work with his hands and be a gentleman. He also commented favorably on my father's stone carvings wherever they turned up, and insisted on pausing to study them, whipping out his notebook to make some quick jottings. Nothing would do, but I must take him on a full tour of the house before he'd consent to rest or take refreshments. I left his valise in the bedroom I'd assigned him, my parents', of course, but he kept lugging the black geoscanner around with him. It was an odd case, taller than it was wide or long, and it had 3 adjustable stubby legs so that it could be set up vertically anywhere. Emboldened by his approval of my father's carvings, I told him about Simon Rhodia and the strangely beautiful towers he was building in Watts. Whereupon the notebook came out again, and there were more jottings. He seemed particularly impressed by the marine quality I found in Rhodia's work. Down in the basement, he had to go there too. He was very much struck by my father's floor set, Gate of Dreams stone carving, and studied it longer than any of the others. I'd been feeling embarrassed about its bold motto and odd placement. Finally, he indicated the octopus eyes staring over the castle and observed, "Kutlu, perchance?" It was the first reference of any sort of the research project that either of us had made since our meeting, and it shook me strangely. But he appeared not to notice and continued with, "You know, Mr. Fisher, I'm tempted to get a reading with Atwood and Pabody's infernal black box right here. Would you object?" I told him certainly not, and to go right ahead, but warned him there was only solid rock under the house. I had told him about my father's dowsing, and even had mentioned Harley Warren, whom it turned out Wilmarth had heard of through a Randolph Carter. He nodded but said, "I'll take a shot at it nonetheless. We must start somewhere, you know." And he proceeded to set up the geoscanner carefully so it was standing vertically on its 3 stubby legs, right in the middle of the carving. He took off his shoes first so as not to risk damaging the rather fine stonework. Then he opened the top of the geoscanner. I glimpsed 2 dials and a large eyepiece. He knelt and applied his eye to it, drawing out a black hood and draping it over his head, very much like an old-fashioned photographer focusing for a picture. "Pardon me, but the indications I must look for are difficult to see," he said muffledly. "Hello, what's this?" There was a longish pause, during which nothing happened, except his shoulders shifted a bit and there were a few faint clicks. Then he emerged from under the hood, tucked it back in the black box, closed the latter, and began to put on and relace his shoes. "The scanner's gone crankish," he explained in answer to my inquiry, "and is seeing ghost vacuities. But not to worry. It only needs new warm-up cells, I fancy, which I have with me, and will be right as rain for tomorrow's expedition. That is, if—" He rolled his eyes up at me in smiling inquiry. "Of course I'll be able to show you my pet trails in the hills," I assured him. "In fact, I'm bursting to." "Capital," he said heartily. But as we left the basement, its rock floor rang out a bit hollowly, it sounded to me, under his high-laced leather-soled and heeled shoes. I was wearing sneakers. It was getting dark, so I started dinner after giving him some iced tea, which he took with lots of lemon and sugar. I cooked eggs and small beefsteaks, figuring from his haggard looks he needed the most restorative sort of food. I also built a fire in the big fireplace against the almost invariable chill of evening. As we ate by its dancing, crackling flames, he regaled me with brief impressions of his trip west. The cold, primeval pine woods of southern New Jersey, with their somberly clad inhabitants speaking an almost Elizabethan English. The very narrow dark roads of West Virginia, the freezing waters of the Ohio flooding unruffled, silent battleship gray, and inevitably menacing under lowering skies, the profound silence of Mammoth Cave, the southern Midwest with its depression-spawned but already legendary bank robbers, the nervous Creole charms of New Orleans' restored French Quarter, the lonely, incredibly long stretches of road in Texas and Arizona that made one believe one was seeing infinity, the great, long, blue, mystery-freighted Pacific rollers, so different from the Atlantic's choppier, shorter-spaced waves, which he'd watched with George Goodenough Akeley, who'd turned out to be a very solid chap, and knowing more about his father's frightening Vermont researches than Wilmarth had expected. When I mentioned finding the shadow over Innsmouth, he nodded and murmured, "The original of its youthful hero has disappeared, and his cousin from the Canton Asylum. Down to Johanna Little? Who knows?" But when I remembered his accumulated mail, he merely nodded his thanks, wincing a little, as though reluctant to face it. He really did look shockingly tired. When we'd finished dinner, however, and he'd taken his black coffee, also with lots of sugar, and the fire was dancing flickeringly, both yellow and blue now, he turned to me with a little venturesomely friendly smile and a big, wonderingly wide lifting of his eyebrows, and said quietly, "And now you'll quite rightly be expecting me to tell you, my dear Fisher, all the things about the project that I've been hesitant to write, the answers I've been reluctant to give to your cogent questions, the revelations I've been putting off making until we should meet in person. Really, you have been very patient, and I thank you." Then he shook his head thoughtfully, his eyes growing distant, as he slowly and rather sinuously and somehow unwillingly shrugged his shoulders, which paradoxically were both frail and wide, and grimaced slightly, as if tasting something strangely bitter, and said even more quietly, "If only I had more to tell you that's been definitely proved. Somehow we always stop just short of that. Oh, the artifacts are real enough and certain, the Innsmouth jewelry, the Antarctic soapstones, Blake's shining trapezohedron, though that's lost in Narragansett Bay. The spiky baluster knob Walnut Gilman brought back from his witchy dreamland, or the non-temporal fourth dimension, if you prefer. Even the unknown elements, meteoric or otherwise, which defy all analysis. Even the new magneto-optic probe, which has given us Virginium and Alabamine. And it's almost equally certain that all, or almost all, those weird extraterrestrial and extra-cosmic creatures have existed. That's why I wanted you to read the Lovecraft stories, despite their lurid extravagances, so you'd have some picture of its entities that I'd be talking to you about. Except that they'd, and the evidence for them, do have a maddening way of vanishing upon extinction, and from all records. Wilbur Whately's mangled remains, his brother's vast invisible cadaver, the Plutonian old Akeley killed and couldn't photograph, the June 1882 meteor itself which struck Nahum Gardner's farm, and which set old Armitage, young then, studying the Necronomicon, the start of everything at Miskatonic, and which Atwood's father saw with his own eyes and tried to analyze, or what Danforth saw down in Antarctica when he looked back at the horrible higher mountains beyond the Mountains of Madness. He's got amnesia for that now that he has regained his sanity. All gone. But whether any of those creatures exist today, there's the rub. The overwhelming question we can't answer, though always on the edge of doing so. The answer is, he went on with gathering urgency, that if they do exist, they are so unimaginably powerful and resourceful they might be, and he looked around sharply, anywhere at the moment. Take Cthulhu, he began. I couldn't help starting as I heard that word pronounced for the first time in my life. The harsh, dark, abysmal, monosyllabic growl it came to was so very like the sound that had originally come to me from my imagination, or my subconscious, or my otherwise unremembered dreams, or... He continued. If Cthulhu exists, then he, or she, or it can go anywhere he wants through space, or air, or sea, or Earth itself. We know from Johansen's account, it's turned his hair white, that Cthulhu can exist as a gas, be torn to atoms, and then recombine. He wouldn't need tunnels to go through solid rock. He could seep through it. Not in the spaces we know, but between them. And yet in his inscrutability he might choose tunnels. There's that to be reckoned with. Or, still another possibility. Perhaps he neither exists nor does not exist, but is in some half-state. Waits dreaming, as Angel's old chant has it. Perhaps his dreams, incarnated as your winged worms, Fisher, dig tunnels. It is those monstrous underground cavern and tunnel worlds, not all from Cthulhu by any means, that I have been assigned to investigate with the geoscanner. Partly because I was the first to hear from them, from old Akeley, and also, merciful creator, from the Plutonian who massed as him. Great worlds of unknown life down there. Blue-litten Kianyan, red-litten Yoth, and black, lightless Nakai, which was Tethathaggua's home, and even stranger inner spaces litten by colors from space and from Earth's nighted core. That's how I guessed the colors in your childhood dreams or nightmares or personality exchanges, my dear Fisher. I've glimpsed them also in the geoscanner, where they are, however, most fugitive and difficult to discern. His voice trailed off tiredly, just as my own concern became most feverishly intense with his mention of personality exchanges. He really did look shockingly fatigued. Nevertheless, I felt impelled to nerve myself to say, perhaps those dreams can be repeated if I take Dr. Morgan's drug. Why not tonight? Out of the question, he replied, shaking his head slowly. In the first place, I wrote too hopefully there. At the last minute, Morgan was unable to supply me with the drug. He promised to send it along by mail, but hasn't yet. In the second place, I'm inclined to think now that it would be much too dangerous an experiment. But at least you'll be able to check those dream colors and the tunnels with your geoscanner. I pressed on, somewhat crestfallen. If I can repair it, he said, his head nodding and slumping to one side. The dying flames were all blue now, as he whispered mumblingly, if I am permitted to repair it. I had to help him to bed and then retired to my own, shaken and unsatisfied, my mind a whirl. Wilmarth's alternating moods of breezy optimism and a seemingly frightened dejection were hard to adjust to. But now I realized that I was very tired myself, after all. I'd been up most of the previous night reading Innsmouth, and soon I slumbered. The voices stridently groan. The pit of primal life, the yellow sign, Azathoth, the magnum illuminandum, the shimmering violet and emerald wings, the cerulean and vermilion claws, great Cthulhu's wasps. Night has fallen. I have limpingly paced the house from the low attic with its circular portholes to the basement, where I touched my father's sledge and eyed the gate of dreams. The moment draws nigh. I must write rapidly. I awoke to bright sunlight, feeling totally refreshed by my customary 12 hours of sleep. I found Wilmarth busily writing at the table that faced the north window of his bedroom. His smiling face looked positively youthful in the cool light. Despite its neatly brushed thatch of white hair, I hardly recognized him. All his accumulated mail except for one item lay open and face downward on the far left-hand corner of the table, while on the far right-hand corner was an impressive pile of newly written and addressed postcards, each with its neatly affixed, fresh 1-cent stamp. "Good morrow, Georg," he greeted me, properly pronouncing it Georg. "If I may so address you, and good news. The scanner is recharged and behaving perfectly, ready for the day's downward surveying. While that letter George Goodenough forwarded is from Francis Morgan and contains a supply of the drug against tonight's inward researches. 2 dosages exactly. Georg, I'll dream with you." He waved a small paper packet. "That's wonderful, Albert," I told him, meaning it utterly. "By the way, it's my birthday," I added. "Congratulations," he said joyfully. "We'll celebrate it tonight with our draughts of Morgan's drug." And our expedition did turn out to be a glorious one. At least until almost its very end. The Hollywood Hills put on their most youthfully winning face. Even the underlying crumbling, worm-eaten corruptions seemed fresh. The sun was hot, the sky bright blue, but there was a steady cool breeze from the west, and occasional great high white clouds casting enormous shadows. Amazingly, Albert seemed to know the territory almost as well as I did. He'd studied his maps prodigiously and brought them along, including the penciled ones I'd sent him. And he instantly named correctly the manzanita, sumac, scrub oak, and other encroaching vegetation through which we wended our way. Every so often, and especially at my favorite pausing places, he would take readings with the geoscanner, which he carried handily, while I had 2 canteens and a small backpack. While his head was under the black hood, I would stand guard, my stick ready. Once I surprised a dark and pinkly pale, fat, large serpent, which went slithering into the underbrush. Before I could tell him, he said correctly, "A king snake, foe of the crotaloids, a good omen." And, on every reading, Albert's black box showed vacuities of some sort, tunnels or caves, immediately below us at depths varying from a few to a few score meters. Somehow this did not trouble us by bright outdoor day. I think it was what we'd both been expecting. Coming out from under the hood, he'd merely nod and say, 15 meters, or the like, and note it down in his little book, and we'd tramp on. Once he let me try my luck under the hood, but all I could see through the eyepiece was what seemed like an intensification of the dancing points of colored light one sees in the dark with the eyes closed. He told me it took considerable training to learn to recognize the significant indications. High in the Santa Monica's, we lunched on beef sandwiches and the tea-flavored lemonade with which I had filled both canteens. Sun and breeze bathed us. Hills were all around, and beyond them, to the west, the blue Pacific. We talked of Sir Francis Drake and Magellan, and of Captain Cook and his great circumpolar voyages, and of the famous lands they'd all heard legends of, and of how the tunnels we were tracing were really no more strange. We spoke of Lovecraft's stories almost as if they were no more than that. Daytime viewpoints can be strangely unworrying and unconcerned. Halfway back or so, Albert began looking very haggard once more, frighteningly so. I got him to let me carry the black box. To do that, I had to abandon my flat backpack and empty canteens. He didn't seem to notice. Almost home, we paused at my father's memorial. The sun had westered most of this way, and there were dark shadows and also shafts of ruddy light almost parallel to the ground. Albert, very weary now, was fumbling for phrases to praise Rhodia's work, when there swiftly glided out of the undergrowth behind him what I first took to be a large rattlesnake. But as I lunged lurchingly toward it, lashing at it with my stick, and as it slid back into thick cover with preternatural rapidity, and as Albert whirled around, the sinuous, vanishing thing looked for an instant to me as if it were all shimmering violet green above the beating wings and bluish scarlet below with claws, while its minatory rattle was more a skirling hum. We raced home, not speaking of it at all, each of us concerned only that his comrade not fall behind. Somewhere, mine found the strength. His postcards had been collected from the box by the road, and there were a half-dozen new letters for him, and a notification of a registered package for me. Nothing must do then, but Albert must drive me down to Hollywood to pick up the package before the post office closed. His face was fearfully haggard, but he seemed suddenly flooded with a fantastic nervous energy, and when I protested that it could hardly be anything of great importance, a tremendous willpower that would brook no opposition. He drove like a veritable demon, and as though the fate of worlds depended on his speed. Hollywood must have thought it was Wallace Reed come back from the dead for another of his transcontinental racing pictures. The Tin Hind fled like a frightened one indeed, as he worked the gear levers smartly, shifting up and down. The wonders were that we weren't arrested and didn't crash. But I got to the proper window just before it closed, and I signed for the package. A stoutly wrapped, tightly sealed, and heavily corded parcel from, it really startled me, Simon Rhodia. Then back again, just as fast despite my protests, the Tin Hind screeching on the corners and curves, my companion's face an implacable, watchful death's mask, up into the crumbling and desiccated hills, as the last streaks of the day faded to violet in the west and the first stars came out. I forced Albert to rest then and drink hot black coffee freighted with sugar, while I got dinner. When he'd stepped out of the car into the chilly night, he'd almost fainted. I grilled steaks again. If he'd needed restorative food last night, he needed it doubly now, after our exhausting hike and our dance of death along the dry, twisting roads, I told him roughly. Or Grim Reaper's tarantella, eh, Georg? He responded with a feeble but unvanquishable little grin. Soon he was prowling around again. He wouldn't stay still, and peering out the windows and then lugging the geoscanner down into the basement. To round out our readings, he informed me. I had just finished building and lighting a big fire in the fireplace when it came hurrying back up. Its first white flare of flame as the kindling caught showed me his ashen face and white circled blue eyes. He was shaking all over, literally. I'm sorry, Georg, to be such a troublesome and seemingly ungrateful guest, he said, forcing himself with a great effort to speak coherently and calmly, though most imperatively. But really, you and I must get out of here at once. There's no place safe for us at this side of Arkham, which is not safe either, but there, at least, we'll have the counsel and support of salted veterans of the Miskatonic Project, whose nerves are steadier than mine. Last night I got and concealed from you. I was sure it had to be wrong. A reading of 15 down there under the carving. Centimeters, Georg. Not meters. Tonight I have confirmed that reading beyond any question of a doubt. Only it's shrunk to 5 under the carving. The floor there is the merest shell. It rings as hollow as a crypt in New Orleans as St. Louis I or II. They have been eating at it from below and are feasting still. No arguments. You have time to pack one small bag. Limit yourself to necessities, but bring that registered parcel from Rhodia. I'm curious about it. And with that, he strode to his bedroom, whence he emerged in a short while with his packed valise and carried it and the black box out to the car. Meanwhile, I'd nerved myself to go down in the basement. The floor did ring much more hollowly than it had last night. It made me hesitate to tread upon it. But otherwise, nothing appeared changed. Nevertheless, it gave me a curious feeling of unreality, as if there were no real objects left in the world. Only flimsy scenery, a few stage properties, including a balsa sledgehammer, a registered parcel with nothing in it, and a cyclorama of nighted hills, and 2 actors. I hurried back upstairs, took the steaks off the grill, and set them on the table in front of the softly roaring fire, for they were done, and headed after Albert. But he anticipated me, stepping back inside the door, looking at me sharply. His eyes were still wide and staring, and demanding. "Why aren't you packed?" I said to him steadily, "Now look here, Albert. I thought last night the cellar floor sounded hollow, so that is not entirely a surprise. And any way you look at it, we can't drive to Arkham on nervous energy. In fact, we can't even decently start driving east without some food inside us. You say yourself it's dangerous everywhere, even a Miskatonic. And from what we, or at least I, saw at my father's grave there may be at least one of these things loose already. So let's eat dinner. I have a hunch terror hasn't taken away your appetite entirely. And have a look inside Rhodia's package, and then leave if we must." There was a rather long pause. Then his expression relaxed into a somewhat wan smile, and he said, "Very well, Georg. That does make sense. I'm frightened, all right. Make no mistake of that. In fact, I've walked in terror for the past 10 years. But in this case, to speak as honestly as I'm able, I have been even more concerned for you. It suddenly seems such a pity, such a disservice, that I should have dragged you into this dreadful business. But as you say, one must bow to necessity, bodily or otherwise, and try to show a little style about it," he added with a rather doleful chuckle. So we sat down before the dancing golden fire and ate our steaks and fixings. I had some burgundy, he stayed with his sweet black coffee, and talked of this and that, chiefly of Hollywood, as it turned out. He'd glimpsed a bookstore on our headlong drive, and now he asked about it, and that led to other things. Our dinner done, I refilled his cup and my glass, then cleared a space and opened Rhodia's parcel, using the carving knife to cut its cords and slit its seals. It contained, carefully packed in excelsior, the casket of embossed copper and German silver, which sits before me now. I recognized my father's handiwork at once, which reproduced quite closely in beaten metal his stone carving in the basement, though without the Gate of Dreams inscription. Albert's finger indicated the Kutlu eyes, though he did not speak the name. I opened the casket. It contained several sheets of heavy bond paper. This time, it was my father's handwriting I recognized. Standing side by side, Albert and I read the document, which I append here. 15 March, 1925. My dear son, today you are 13, but I write to you and wish you well when you are 25. Why I do so you will learn as you read this. The box is yours. Leb wol. I leave it with a friend to send to you if I should go in the 12 years between. Nature has given me signs that may be. Jagged flashes of rare earth colors in my eyes from time to time. Now read with care, for I am telling secrets. When I was a boy in Louisville, I had dreams by day and could not remember them. They were black times in my mind that were minutes long, the longest half an hour. Sometimes I came to in another place, and doing something different, but never harmful. I thought my black daydreams were a weakness or a judgment, but nature was wise. I was not strong and did not know enough to bear them yet. Under my father's rule I learned my craft and made my body strong, and always studied when and as I could. When I was 25, I was deep in love. This was before your mother, with a beautiful girl who died of consumption. Pining upon her grave, I had a daydream. But this time, by the strength of my desire, I kept my mind white. I swam down through the loam, and I was joined with her in full bodily union. She said this coupling must be our last, but that I now would have the power to move at will under and through the earth from time to time. We kissed farewell forever, Lorchen and I swam down and on, her night of dreams, exulting in my strength like some old kobold breasting the rock. It is not black down there, my son, as one would think. There are glorious colors. Water is blue, metals bright red and yellow, rocks green and brown. Unzovita. After a time I swam back and up into my body, standing on the new-made grave. I was no longer pining, but profoundly grateful. So I learned how to divine, my son, to be a fish of earth when there is need and nature wills, to dive into the hall of the mountain king dancing with light. Always the finest colors and the strangest hues lay west. Rare earths they are, named by scientists, who are wise though blind. That's why I brought us here, under the greatest of oceans. Earth is a rainbow web, and nature is a spider spinning and walking it. And now you have shown you have my power, mein Sohn, but in a greater form. You have black night dreams. I know, for I have sat by you as you slept, and heard you talk, and seen your terror, which would soon destroy you if you could recall it, as one night showed. But nature in her wisdom blindfolds you until you have the needed strength and learning. As you know by now, I have provided for your education at a good Eastern school, praised by Harley Warren, the finest employer that I ever had, who knew a lot about the nether realms. And now you're strong enough, mein Sohn, to act, and wise, I hope, as nature's acolyte. You've studied deep and made your body strong. You have the power, and the hour has come. The Triton blows his horn. Rise up, mein lieber Georg, and follow me. Now is the time. Build upon what I've built, but build more greatly. Yours is the wider and the greater realm. Make your mind white, with or without some lovely woman's help. Now burst the gate of dreams. Your loving father. At any other time, that document would have moved and shaken me profoundly. Truth to tell, it did so move and shake me. But I had been already so moved and shaken by today's climactic events that my first thought was of how the letter applied to them. I echoed from the letter, "Now burst the gate of dreams," and then added, suppressing another interpretation. That means I should take Morgan's drug tonight. Let's do it, Albert, as you proposed this morning. Your father's last command, he said heavily, clearly much impressed by that aspect of the letter. Then, Georg, this is a most fantastic, shattering missive. That sign he got sounds like migraine, and his references to the rare earth elements. That could be crucial, and colors in the earth perceived perhaps by extrasensory perception. The Miskatonic Project should have started investigating dowsing years ago. We've been blind. He broke off. You're right, Georg, and I am strongly tempted. But the danger. How to choose? On the one hand, a supreme parental injunction and our raging curiosities, for mine's a boil. On the other hand, great Cthulhu and his minions. Oh, for an indication of how to decide. There was a sharp knocking at the door. We both started. After a moment's pause, I moved rapidly, Albert following. With my hand on the latch, I paused again. I'd not heard a car stop outside. Through the stout oak came the cry, "Telegram!" I opened it. There was revealed a skinny, somewhat jaunty-looking youth of pale complexion, scattered with big freckles and with carrot-red hair under his visored cap. His trousers were wrapped tightly around his legs by bicycle clips. "Either of you Albert N. Wilmarth?" he inquired coolly. "I am he," Albert said, stepping forward. "Then sign for this, please." Albert did so and tipped him, substituting a dime for a nickel at the last instant. The youth grinned widely, said, "Good night," and sauntered off. I closed the door and turned quickly back. Albert had torn open the flimsy envelope and drawn out and spread the missive. He was pale already, but as his eyes flashed across it, he grew paler still. It was as if he were 2/3 of a ghost already, and its message had made him a full one. He held the yellow sheet out to me wordlessly. "Lovecraft is dead. Stop. The whippoorwills did not sing. Stop. Take courage. Stop. Danforth." I looked up. Albert's face was still as ghostly white, but its expression had changed from uncertainty and dread to decision and challenge. "That tips the balance," he said. "What have I more to lose? By George, Georg, we'll have a look down into the abyss on whose edge we totter. Are you game?" "I proposed it," I said. "Shall I fetch your valise from the car?" "No need," he said, whipping from the inside breast pocket the small paper packet from Dr. Morgan he'd shown me that morning. "I had the hunch that we were going to use it, until that apparition at your father's tomb shattered my nerves." I fetched small glasses. We split evenly between them the small supply of white powder, which dissolved readily in the water I added under his direction. Then he looked at me quizzically, holding his glass as if for a toast. "No question of to whom we drink this," I said, indicating the telegram he was still holding in his other hand. He winced slightly. "No, don't speak his name. Let's rather drink to all our brave comrades who have perished or suffered greatly in the Miskatonic Project." That hour really warmed me. We touched glasses and drained them. The draught was faintly bitter. "Morgan writes that the effects are quite rapid," he said. "First drowsiness, then sleep, and then hopefully dreams. He's tried it twice himself with Rice and doughty old Armitage, who laid the Dunwich Horror with him. The first time they visited in dream, Gilman's Walpurgis hyperspace. The second, the inner city at the two magnetic poles, an area topologically unique. Meanwhile, I'd hurriedly poured a little more wine and lukewarm coffee, and we'd settled ourselves comfortably in our easy chairs before the fire, the dancing flames of which became both a little blurred and a little dazzling as the drug began to take effect. "Really, that was a most amazing missive from your father," he chatted on rapidly. "Spinning a rainbow web under the Pacific. The lines, those weirdly little tunnels, truly most vivid. Would Cthulhu be the spider? No, by gad. I'd prefer your father's goddess Nature any day. She's kindlier, at least." "Albert," I said, somewhat drowsily, thinking of personality exchanges. "Could those creatures possibly be benign, or at least less malevolent than we infer, as my father's subterranean visionings might indicate? My winged worms, even?" "Most of our comrades do not find them so," he replied judiciously. "Though, of course, there's our Innsmouth hero. What has he really found in Yaha Nlethe? Wonder and glory? Who knows? Who can say he knows? Or old Akeley out in the stars? Is his brain suffering the tortures of the damned in its shining metal cylinder? Or is it perpetually exalted by ever-changing true visions of infinity? And what did poor Shoggoth stampeded Danforth really think he saw beyond the 2 horrific mountain chains down there before he got amnesia? And is that last a blessing or a curse? Gad, he and I are suited to each other. The mind smitten helping, the nerve shattered. Fit nurses for felines." "That was surely heavy news he sent you," I observed with a little yawn, indicating the telegram about Lovecraft, which he still held tightly between finger and thumb. "You know, before that wire came, I had the craziest idea that somehow you and he were the same person. I don't mean Danforth, but—" "Don't say it," he said sharply. Then his voice went immediately drowsy as he continued. "But the roster of the perished is longer far. Poor Lakend, poor Gedney, and all those others under their Southern Cross and Magellanic Shroud. The mathematical genius Walter Gilman, who lost heart most terribly. The nonagenarian street-slain Angel and lightning-frozen Blake in Providence. Edward Pickman Derby, Arkham's plump Shelley deliquescing in his witch-wife's corpse. Gad, this is hardly the cheerfulest topic. You know, Georg, down in San Diego, young Akeley, G.G., showed me a hidden sea cave bluer than Capri, and on its black beach of magnetite, the webbed footprint of a merman. One of the Nori? And then, oh yes, of course, there's Wilbur Whately, who was almost 9 feet tall, though he hardly counts as a Miskatonic researcher. But the whippoorwills didn't get him either. Or his big brother. I was still looking at the fire, and the dancing points of light in and around it had become the stars, thick as the Pleiades and Hyades, through which old Akeley journeyed eternally, when unconsciousness closed on me, too, black as the wind-stirred, infinite gulf of darkness which Robert Blake saw in the shining trapezohedron, black as Nakai. I awoke, stiff and chilled. The fire at which I'd been staring was white ashes only. I felt a sharp pang of disappointment that I had not dreamed at all. Then I became aware of the low, irregular, inflected humming or buzzing that filled my ears. I stood up with difficulty. My companion slumbered still, but his shut-eyed, death-pale face had a hideously tormented look, and he writhed slowly and agonizedly from time to time, as if in the grip of foulest nightmare. The yellow telegram had fallen from his fingers and lay on the floor. As I approached him, I realized that the sound filling my ears was coming from between his lips, which were unceasingly a twitch, and as I leaned my head close to them, The horridly articulate droning became recognizable words and phrases. "The pulpy, tentacled head," I heard in horror. "Cthulhu Fatagen," "the wrong geometry," "the polarizing miasma," "the prismatic distortion," "Cthulhu Rilye," "the positive blackness," "the living nothingness." I could not bear to watch this dreadful agony or listen to those poisonous, twangy words an instant longer, so I seized him by the shoulders and shook him violently, though even as I did so there sprang into my mind my father's stern injunction never to do so. His eyes came open wide in his white face, and his mouth clamped shut as he came up with a powerful shove of his bent arms against the chair's arms, which his hands had been clutching. It was as if it were happening in slow motion, though, paradoxically, it also seemed to be happening quite swiftly. He gave me a last mute look of utter horror, and then he turned and ran, taking fantastically long strides, out through the door, which his outstretched hand threw wide ahead of him, and disappeared into the night. I hobbled after him as swiftly as I could. I heard the motor catch at the starter's second prod. I screamed, "Wait, Albert, wait!" As I neared the tin hind, its lights flashed on and its motor roared, and I was engulfed in acrid exhaust fumes as it screeched out the drive, with a spattering of gravel and down the first curve. I waited there then in the cold until all sight and sound of it had vanished in the night, which was already paling a little with the dawn. And then I realized that I was still hearing those malignant, gloating, evilly resonant voices. "Cthulhu Fatagen," they were saying, and have been saying, and are saying now, and will forever. The spider tunnels, the black infinities, the colors in pitch darkness, the tiered towers of Yuggoth, the glittering centipedes, the winged worms. Somewhere not far off I heard a low, half-articulate whirring sound. I went back into the house and wrote this manuscript. And now I shall place the last with its interleaved communications and also the 2 books of poetry that led to all this in the copper and German silver casket, and I shall carry that with me down into the basement, where I shall take up my father's sledge, wondering in which body I shall survive, if at all, and literally carry out his last letter's last injunction. Very early on the morning of Tuesday, March 16, 1937, the householders of Paradise Crest, then Vulture's Roost, were disturbed by a clashing rumble and a sharp earth shock, which they attributed to an earthquake. And indeed, very small tremors were registered at Griffith Observatory, UCLA, and USC, though on no other seismographs. Daylight revealed that the brick house locally known as Fisher's Folly had fallen in so completely that not one brick remained joined to another. Moreover, there appeared to be fewer bricks in view than the house would have accounted for, as if half of them had been trucked away during the night, or else fallen into some great space beneath the basement. In fact, the appearance of the ruin was of a gigantic ant-lion's pit, lined by bricks instead of sand grains. The place was deemed, and actually was, dangerous, and was shortly filled in and in part cemented over, and apparently not long afterward rebuilt upon. The body of the owner, a quietly spoken, crippled young man named Georg Reuter Fischer, was discovered flat on its face in the edge of the rubble, with hands thrown out, the metal casket by one of them, as though he had been trying to flee outdoors when caught by the collapse. His death, however, was attributed to a slightly earlier accident or insane act of self-destruction involving acid, of which his eccentric father was once known to have kept a supply. It was well that easy identification was made possible by his conspicuously twisted right foot, for when the body was turned over, it was discovered that something had eaten away the entire front of his face, and also those portions of his skull and jaw, and the entire forebrain.